Welcome back, everybody, to our second panel, going towards building trust in technology, or at least that's what the title says. I don't know whether that's indeed what the speakers will be doing. Having listened to the questions earlier in the earlier session, it may not only be about building trust, but so welcome back to all, and I hope that many of you have done another 500 steps to get to the 10,000 steps for today during the break. I did try to do so. But anyway, so my name is Esther van Zimmeren, and I'm a coordinator of the GOVTRUST Center of Excellence and specialize in intellectual property law, also doing some research on trust. So you can understand that it's a great pleasure for me to be able to chair this session. But much more importantly, of course, our speakers for today, for this panel. So we will start with Dr. Bjorn Kleizen, followed by Professor Balázs Bodó. I practiced during the break. Balázs as garage. Thank you for that hint. And so we will start with Bjorn, who is a postdoctoral researcher also with the GOVTRUST Center of Excellence, with the research group Politics and Public Governance. And his research is focused on the trust dynamics of integrating large-scale data projects and AI projects in order to improve governmental services. And the factors that he is looking into are not only external stakeholders, that's what we have heard already a lot about today, but also internal stakeholders, so including also civil servants. And so I think we can move to you, Bjorn. You have the floor, and as agreed upon, we will be strict in terms of time, and I will inform you 5 to 2 minutes in advance that you how much time you have left. Okay, so please go ahead, Bjorn.
Thank you, Esther. I believe you should see my presentation now. I'm not sure if it's full screen yet, though. Probably not.
We can see it, but indeed not yet full screen. Yes. Perfect.
Supposed to be doing something? Yeah, perfect. Okay, thank you, Esther, and thank you for giving me the chance to present a bit about my research today. As Esther said, I've been involved heavily with studying AI in government in the context of the Digi4Fed project, which examines the implications of new technologies such as big data, AI, and blockchain for the federal government in Belgium. The research I'll be presenting today is actually mostly about the citizens' perspective. So under what conditions do citizens trust AI in government? And yeah, we've held 2 survey experiments there and a number of interviews related to that as well, but those were civil servants and NGOs then. I think enough has been said about the relevance of trust already in the keynotes, for instance, so I won't go too deeply into that. But of course, it's also an issue that's very relevant for public sector organizations. Extreme examples are, of course, COVID-19 policies, where we really can see that erosions of trust lead to issues for governments implementing their policies, but also in the context with AI. In the Netherlands, for instance, there have been a few issues with AI models being discriminatory. The US has seen similar issues that really can cause drops in trust as well. And those lead to severe criticism for governments, of course. So trust is important. I'll leave it at that for now. One thing I do want to say is I'm consciously using the term citizens here and not users. This also goes back to my question really for the first presentation. And that is because, well, in the private sector, most of the algorithms we are used to are very Facebooky or Netflixy in a sense. You start at Netflix, you choose something, your nephew comes over, watches a cartoon, and all of a sudden your Netflix preference list is full of cartoons. That makes sense because you directly use the system, you know where it comes from. In the government, it sometimes works like that. So our Flemish employment agency, for instance, has a few algorithms that when you use them, you can directly evaluate it provides you with suggestions of what type of job you might be interested in. But there's also a host of other algorithms, of course. One of particular interest, which distinguish itself from the private sector, are algorithms that could potentially look into your probability of committing fraud, thereby making you an interesting risk candidate, of course, for further inquiry by inspectors. Not too many of those around in Belgium yet, although the police is working with one for companies that might be committing fraud. Others might work with your location data, often anonymized, of course, but might try to identify what you're doing in a specific area, whether you're an interesting tourist and the like. Those are things that are often used by municipalities to inform their economic policies. And, well, as a citizen, you don't directly use those, right? Of course, you use them in the sense that your data is being used and you can get the implications of them, but you're not often aware that those algorithms exist, aside from what you hear in the media and press releases, and you don't directly see algorithmic output. So that's a bit of context I wanted to provide with you. And then we have two questions in the context of that is, so in that context, where citizens are further away from the algorithm, so to say, can we still convince citizens that their AI project is trustworthy, a governmental AI project is trustworthy? And on the other hand, that's more of an alternate question there, what the role of pre-existing attitudes and perceptions is, such as trusting government, trusting technology, privacy concern, and I'll get into that. So where we currently stand, both in academic literature and more what policymakers use, are a lot of insights from legal disciplines, also the AI ethics and AI philosophy literature, computer science, where it's data science, on how to make AI trustworthy. I won't go into the academic literature too deeply, but one good summary of that is, for instance, the guidelines that have been presented by the EU high-level expert group, which presupposes that AI, to be trustworthy, should be lawful, ethical, and technically robust in a sense. And they distill 7 principles from those 3 factors. They distill that there should be some level of human agency, human autonomy, as we've seen in previous presentations, but also oversight. So keeping a human in the loop in the decision-making progress. They should be technically robust and safe, for instance, against data leaks. You should ensure privacy, so GDPR-related issues, for instance, here in Europe. They should be transparent, both about the policies, but also the algorithm itself, of course, because in some cases there are black box issues. But there are also solutions to those black box issues, often called explainable AI. So really trying to explain why you arrived at a certain prediction. Then there's diversity, non-discrimination, and fairness. So in the US, we, for instance, had a problem with a recidivism algorithm that seemed to pick up for ethnic minorities a greater recidivism risk, therefore non-ethnic minorities, not based on some objective criterion. That should be avoided normally. Societal and environmental well-being, and accountability. So 7 principles that are very relevant. And what we noticed in interviews is actually, so 10 interviews were held with governments in both the Netherlands and in Belgium for this project. And we noticed in interviews that these types of guidelines are gaining some prominence with these organizations, especially in light of some of these crises, such as with the US recidivism algorithm or the Dutch risk detection algorithm that was discriminatory, maybe. That is kind of providing an impulse for governments to look at their AI and see whether this would be trustworthy. And their hope often is that it will also increase societal trust in their algorithms, right? But this arrives at a very interesting assumption that if you enhance the trustworthiness of your AI, that you actually also increase the trust that citizens that are so far away from the algorithm actually have in your AI. We also held a few interviews with NGOs, and I won't go too deeply into that, but one thing that we really noticed there is that they don't evaluate specific AI projects. How can they? That makes sense, right? You can't look at every AI project in a government, let alone several levels of government. They often use salient cases, crises that have occurred, some more mythical status things, so like the electrical meters in Belgium are a big thing that might be used to trace people in the future and might be overly invasive. So those are meters installed in your home, which can look at your energy consumption. But this creates an interesting mismatch. Governments are often quite optimistically busy trying to make their algorithms more trustworthy by including legal measures, ethical AI measures, and making models explainable, for instance, with local explanations, trying to increase data safety, trying to act conform to the GDPR, and often working on the assumption that by doing so, they have gained the trust of citizens, but we do not know whether that is the case. So how can we test that? We've held 2 experiments, actually. A similar setup has been seen by in the previous papers as well, especially that by Michelle and Xian. So what we did is we presented a text with 3 algorithms, so as not to prime them on one specific algorithm in government. One on road maintenance, you use image data on potholes in the roads to improve the way you can manage those roads. That's something Dutch governments are looking at. Tax fraud detection, I've explained that already, and as I explained in the beginning, something where you can use location data from phones to track visitor flows to certain events, for instance, so you can allocate ambulances and police in a more optimal way. So that's the baseline in a sense, but then we provide a few treatments. So to make the analogy of a medical experiment, those are our medicines that we add to the placebo. In experiment 1, we've added some information on how legally compliant they were, focusing specifically on DPO functions, so data protection officer functions, and making sure there's a legal base for the government to actually process your data and use that AI. So in the second one, we had the no harm principle and explainability. No harm refers to that you, at least on the societal level, try to engage your AI to benefit society. Also information on how data was gathered, whether it was gathered in an anonymized way or not. And experiment 2, we focused on the human in the loop. I just explained that there's always a human in the loop in the decision-making process of governments. Information on non-discrimination, basically de-biasing techniques that a government may use to prevent discrimination. And finally, technical robustness, which refers to the degree to which your data is kept safe. So by adding these pieces of information, we hope to somehow induce an effect whereby citizens trust these AI projects more, right? One thing I want to also explain in this, and I'll really go to the results, is before they actually went into these experimental conditions, we also asked a few preliminary questions on pre-existing attitudes, very similar to what Xian presented in a sense: privacy concern, trust in government, trust in AI, whether they were part of a group that was discriminated against. I'll explain that in a bit. Whether they worked with AI, those sort of things, so pre-existing attitudes and experiences. Then they were randomized across groups. And for instance, with our free interventions or free medicine, so to speak, we arrived at 12 groups for experiment 1. And that's because we can also combine various forms of these medicines to see whether a combination of legal information and ethical AI information provides a different effect than just providing legal information, right? So there's actually 12 groups in experiment 1 and 8 in experiment 2. And the difference there becomes because we had 2 variations of the data gathering treatments for experiment 1. So that increases the amount of groups. Right. On to the results. Can, by providing information, being transparent on how you apply AI as a government and what measures you have taken, can you actually increase trust? And the answer, and that's why it's a bit awkward that I'm in the building trust portion maybe, is unfortunately we don't see much evidence of that. We have 3 dependents. One is the trust, the degree to which respondents trust these AI projects, the degree to which they will be willing to give their data, which is a form of behavioral trust, right? You're willing to make yourself vulnerable, and the degree of policy support. And especially for experiment 1, the control group you can see at the bottom of each of these graphs, they don't differ so much from any of the intervention groups. We can also see this in R-squared measures, for instance, but also the F-test. The R-squared approaches 0 basically, so we have 0 explained variance almost, and the F-test is not even significant. There was one group in experiment 1 significant, but it was actually a negative effect, and that was the legal group, I believe. But yeah, the F-test isn't entirely significant, so that's a bit, drawing any conclusions on that is a bit, well, ambitious. The results from experiment 2, so this is the one more with human in the loop data, technical robustness, and non-discrimination. Again, you see the control group at the bottom and the degree to which the intervention groups induced an effect on all the other bars. And again, we don't see much of an effect. It's a little bit bigger than for the previous experiment, which may also have to do with the panel we have used in this specific experiment, which was more focused on political experiments anyhow, so that might have actually influenced results here. But again, the R-squared approach is 0. And well, the F-test is again not significant either, meaning, well, in terms of interpretability, these results are also really tenuous at best. The robustness and the fairness and robustness intervention does seem to have some degree of a significant effect at the 5% level, a positive effect in this case as well. But again, as the F-test of the entire model is not significant, I would not hedge my bets or millions of euros on actually including information on fairness and non-discrimination and technical robustness to actually induce more trust. So that seems very tenuous. Right. So then we have a second question, right? These pre-existing attitudes that people have, do they maybe explain the degree to which they trust these AI systems? And there we see far greater effects. So for trusting government, we only rest that on giving data because otherwise you run into some common method bias issues. We actually tried it with the other two as well, it works there as well, but these are the only ones we have some faith in. When people already trust government, they seem to trust these AI projects. When people already trust AI, they also seem to trust the AI projects that we presented on governments. Privacy concern had a severely strong negative effect on the degree to which citizens trusted these AI projects. And then AI use in your job has some effects, as did computer self-efficacy, which was a control variable, by the way. But a more consistent effect we see with discrimination again, although for giving your data, so the behavioral trust question, we didn't see any effect, which is interesting, and I don't specifically have an explanation for that. What I do want to mention with discrimination here is the reason we included whether people were part of a group that they felt was discriminated against in Belgium is actually because these people might feel more threatened with a government using their data. So a government using their data to track fraud, given the history that these people have with governmental organizations and society in general, might be less inclined to judge those systems favorably, right? And that is something we indeed find. Now, why is this relevant?
Sorry to interrupt. You have about 3 more minutes.
3 more minutes. I'm almost done, but thanks. Now, why is this relevant specifically? So we can't seem to really induce trust by providing information in our press releases or media articles, but we are kind of dependent on society for the level of trust that they place in our governmental projects, right? And when you look at the distributions of the perceived trustworthiness of government and privacy concern, we actually see that there are sizable amounts of people that believe government should not be trusted, or are very concerned about their privacy, which was asked in this experiment specifically within the context of their privacy concern towards governments, whether they would like governments to process their data, whether they're concerned about governments having and sharing their data. And that's kind of provides an argument that we should sometimes be a bit careful with what type of AIs we develop and implement in the public sector. As a certain group of society, you will never be able to take along maybe if these results are indeed correct. Now, what I've listed on the right section of this slide is also interesting. We've added an open field after the behavioral trust question. So, would you be willing to give your data to the federal government for this type of project? And then we added an open field to ask them, okay, why did you answer the previous item the way you did? And there we see the entire range of attitudes that people have towards this idea. On the very negative side, we have responses like Big Brother is watching. On the positive side, that's also another side of the story. There's a decent amount of citizens that say something along the lines as, I have nothing to hide as long as this adds to effectiveness. But these are almost evenly divided in a sense, although, yeah, they are almost evenly divided, come to think of it. What's also interesting is in the beginning I mentioned that that private citizens often don't have the capacity to judge all projects in government, and that's reflected in the middle quote. We've seen a few of these trust breach quotes as well. So we never said anything about an algorithm or a computer system in general that withheld benefits from someone. Nonetheless, this person with the middle quote apparently judged our algorithms, the ones we presented, based on an experience she had with governments revoking their benefits. And I think that's an important thing aspect for future research, that we don't always evaluate algorithms based on these algorithms themselves. Instead, we assign them to a class, and we assign a certain degree of legitimacy to that class of governments using AI algorithms. And that, of course, is a risk. So if your neighboring municipality commits a grave transgression with their algorithm, that will reflect on the trust in your algorithm. So I think these trust breaches might be an interesting aspect of for future research. This is a bit more context on these comments, but I'll skip that for now. So what can we conclude from this in terms of building trust? So trustworthiness, in the terms of those ethical AI guidelines I presented in the beginning, is of course a good aim from any good governance viewpoint. You want to be trustworthy as a government, right? However, we've seen in interviews that governments kind of see them as a quick fix to all the trust problems that are inherent in these projects, and that doesn't seem to be the case. You probably can't induce a direct effect for citizens that just view your algorithms in a media article or in a press release or in something they see on the TV news in the evening. So don't expect any wonders in that regard. Also, the diversity in attitudes, I think, is an important insight to keep into account, that there is probably 30 to 40% that won't trust your algorithm if you make a very invasive algorithm, which can lead to all sorts of issues in the media, right, as a government. And I'll keep this brief because it's a wall of text, but just to...
And you're basically out of time as well.
Yeah. So I'll just keep it at this for now, and maybe you can pick it up in the questions afterwards otherwise. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for that, Bjorn. I think you had already a lot of very rich information in your presentation, and maybe also some of it our next speaker can already refer to it and also link to it. So thank you for that, Bjorn. And I see again a lot of clapping hands. So keep your thoughts and ideas and questions for Bjorn, or put them in the chat, as also the previous chair mentioned to you. And so we're moving now to the presentation of Professor Balázs Bodó from the University of Amsterdam, the Institute for Information Law. So Professor Bodó is an associate professor doing socio-legal research. And in 2018, he started carrying out the research for his ERC grant, which allowed him to study the legal and political implications of blockchain-based technologies. And it also enabled him to set up a blockchain and society policy research lab. I can really recommend you to go to his website. Probably he has much more to offer than just he can tell in this presentation. It's really wonderful research that he's doing with this lab. He's also an expert for the European Commission, especially related to blockchain related projects. He did in the past also fellowships at Harvard University, Stanford University, and he has a really broad interest also in copyright. So as an IP person, I can only say this must be really interesting. So Professor Bodó, please go ahead, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. What I'm going to present you came out from the blockchain ERC project, but it's not related to blockchain. But nevertheless, the blockchain enthusiasts raised a very interesting question: what constitutes a trustworthy technological infrastructure? So in the recent years, my attention turned towards how societal trust relations are being transformed or disrupted by digitization. What I'm going to present is a paper under review. The title is Commodification of Trust, and it's the preprint is available by SSRN. Again, I'll post you a link. And it's a theoretical paper. So what I've tried to do here is synthesize trust-related research from various disciplines and build towards a new framework which would allow us to look into the transformation of societal trust relations and digitization. So let me check that. So I define trust as a resource which can actually help strangers to cooperate or coexist across various distances, whether they be cultural or economic or social or geographic. And I was trained as an economist as well, so I think that if trust is a societal resource, then it can be produced. Which means that we can actually create or design ways to reduce risks and uncertainties which we use trust to overcome. And we can do that by a number of ways. We can create more familiarity, we can create more control, we can create more insurance, or we can create a network of distrust. So trust relations are more easy to emerge because trust is easier to achieve if we know that the counterparty or the trustee is from the same background, or I have some ways to actually control his or her behavior, or I can insure against the potential risks and harms this trust relationship involves. And if you look at trust as a resource which can be produced, then we can ask this question of where is this resource coming from? And in fact, if we think about it, we can identify three major logics of trust production, or three major types of infrastructures where trust the prerequisites of trust, or the building blocks of trust, are coming from. The first one is the most ancient one, or the most familiar one to every one of us. It's the interpersonal communal trust infrastructures, where networks of people organized by familiar or ethnic or tribal or political or epistemic proximity create the conditions for trust. We see that with professional associations, we see that with shared faith or experience communities. So it's a very communal way to trust each other, where a group produces trust for the members of the troop. The second one is more related to the modern state, right? These are the public infrastructures which emerged to actually bridge all these communal trust infrastructures at the rise of the modern state in the 16th and 17th century. The state produces trust by providing free education to our kids, or through public service media, or through the court system, the legal system, through high quality public services, whether it's healthcare or national security, a fair disinterested public administration, commitment to public values, rule of law, etc., etc. Here, trust, this public trust infrastructure, tries to produce trust as a free public service, right, and which we pay for through taxation. And of course, there is a third class or group of trust infrastructures which are private, where you can buy trust or trustworthiness signals as a product. Bankers, credit rating agencies, insurers, accountants, lawyers, brands sell a certain kind of certainty. And what I'm arguing is that in recent years, a new class of private trust producers have emerged, which are producing trust or selling trustworthiness signals on a planetary scale using algorithms. And we know them. We know the Ubers, the eBays, the platforms which try to convince us that whatever they are connecting us to is actually something worthy of us to trust. What I'm arguing in another paper, though, is that we have no reason to trust these infrastructural private trust producers, because we cannot really have an ID, or we cannot really verify whether they are capable of doing what they are doing. We have no way to actually assume that they are benevolent, so they are acting in our best interest, and often there are major misalignment in ethics and morals as well. So the question is, what happens when in society we are more and more exposed to technological trust producers, which either try to produce trust through the control of the past, like through building reputation management systems, or try to produce trust through the control of the present, like blockchains do, where we try to encode and enforce rules through infrastructures, or where they try to produce trust through the reduction of uncertainty through the control of the future, like machine learning and AI systems do. What happens when both public and private parties, both institutions and individuals, stake the task of producing trusted, the conditions for trusted social relations to these private technological trust producers, who, again, we have very little reason to trust in the first place, because they are unable to provide independently verifiable signals or safeguards of their trustworthiness. I would like to offer and close this talk maybe through inviting you to think together with me of what are the trust dynamics in society when these trust producers, private technological trust producers, become prominent. And I came up with a number of not so speculative scenarios, if you like. First, the one we can witness in China is that the public trust infrastructures and the private trust producers act in concert, and they merge in one way or another, and they create a unified trust framework, if you like, where access to public services is conditional upon being shown trustworthy by private providers and vice versa. And these infrastructures merge to serve political goals and try to cover as much of the everyday life as possible. These become then control infrastructures which have the citizen have very little wiggle room to or very few opportunities to escape. A second option is what we are seeing maybe in some Western countries, that there is a continuous erosion and the gradual breakdown of the public trust infrastructures and the corresponding tribalization of the society. The US comes to my mind first and foremost to illustrate this point, where what we see is that trust in government is slowly eroding, and as this previous speaker has pointed out, Bjorn, sometimes public institutions try to address this problem by involving various technological solutions, hoping that the use of AI systems or algorithms would actually increase their trustworthiness because they are apparently unbiased or objective. But that may or may not work out, and as we have seen, if these technologies are actually untrustworthy and then they ultimately fail, when that happens, it's the trust in the government or trust in those institutions which takes a hit. So there is a potential for a vicious circle here where untrustworthy or untrusted government agencies lose more trust by trying to boost their trustworthiness by deploying untrustworthy technologies. And where it leads to is the actual tribalization of societies, where people actually revert to other forms of trust infrastructures, such as the communal ones, which can, where it might be very difficult for these communal trust infrastructures to build trust across their boundaries. And this is a clear danger identified also by the US Secret Service, is that society can break down into in communicating tribal groups. A third option maybe is that we work so hard to make all these systems private systems trustworthy, and then we end up these systems crowding out public trust infrastructures. And that I call the French-led scenario after snow crash, where many of the public trust-producing tasks are actually provided by these private players. We know from research the cost of that, the social and individual cost of that, where the inclusion or the exclusion in private trust services not just requires labor, but exclusion means social economic objection as well. And the platform labor platform work research has plenty of evidence to do that. I'm originally from Hungary, so I also see that what happens when the state, not just the state is captured, but the state's trust production capacity is also captured by private groups, and mafia state in that sense is clearly capturing the privatization of state trust production functions. Okay, so što dělať? I would like to close with a manifesto of sorts, if you like. On the one hand, what we are threatened by is that the breakdown of public trust infrastructures. So we are between a rock and a hard place. So on the one hand, the emergence of private trust infrastructures threatens with the commodification of trust. On the other hand, the breakdown of public trust infrastructures threatens with the fragmentation and tribalization of trust. So what I see as a major problem here is that these public trust production logics in the middle are being hollowed out. And this is what we see here is not that there are all these new technological players which start to produce trust where previously there has been none, but that they are actually taking over and competing with the public trust infrastructures. And this is not a future I would like to I would like my son to live in. So the question is, how can we prevent that, or how can we change course? And I see that we spend a lot of time trying to make sure that these private trust producers are trustworthy, or even if they don't, we try to convince people to trust them. And we do that all over the place with the AI Act, with ethical AI, with user experiences, with various fairness, accountability, transparency frameworks. But even if all these efforts, scholarly efforts and political efforts succeed, all we achieved was that we had to privatize trust production. And on the other hand, in the political arena, what I see is that we spend so much less time actually thinking about how can we preserve trust in the dwindling communal and public trust infrastructures, maybe with the same tools, or maybe with the same focus and attention. In order to do that, maybe we have to somehow reprioritize also some of our research and asking what these private trust infrastructure need to be. Ask from ourselves as citizens or as societies, what kind of trust infrastructures do we want to rely on? What kind of trust what kind of trustworthy government we can define for ourselves? From that, a number of tasks flow. I think one of the most important for us is to
sorry to interrupt you. You have about 2.5 minutes left.
This is my last slide.
Excellent.
Thank you.
Go ahead.
I'm paying attention to the time. Maybe we should focus on questions like how we can maintain or increase trust in government and preserve that goal at all costs. Invest more in social cohesion, solidarity, high quality public services, which have been shown to be key drivers of trust in government. I think, and this was behind my previous question, that my first question to the first speaker, Shyam, is that maybe we should not trust tech. This should not be our starting point. Maybe we should start engaging with new technologies with distrust. rather than with trust, and treat them as untrustworthy rather than trying to make sure that people trust them. And it's a very different approach. I think most of our trust in tech was faith-based. We were sold on this idea that tech can solve many things. I think after 20 years of disappointment, we are smarter than that. So we can actually start from this position that just tech is not to be trusted to begin with. I think we shouldn't try to work on replacing trusted institutions with untrustworthy technology. We shouldn't outsource core tasks. We shouldn't let institutional knowledge be privatized, and we should spend time on strengthening our institutions. I think it's a good strategy, a good policy to be risk averse and for institutions. So I try to, in the Netherlands, moderate expectations in the public sector when it comes to new technologies. And I just try to convince them, like, yeah, maybe like, it's not a good idea to actually experiment with AI or blockchain because it's just creating more risks and uncertainties and puts your position in place. And finally, when it comes to the competition with either the US or the China, it should not be necessarily on technology excellence, but maybe on societal values. So this is part of a much larger research. I leave it at that. If you want to read the paper, this is the link, the QR code to the paper. It's on SSRN. And I'm looking forward to your questions or comments or criticism. Thank you.
So, yeah, so thank you very much for that very inspiring presentation. I will definitely go to SSRN to read that paper. Wonderful. I already see immediately that we have somebody who raised his hand. Please go ahead, Ferenc Mutrice.
Yeah, thank you very much for the opportunity. My name is Ferenc Mutrice from the Hungarian Central Statistical Office Methodology Department, and I've been working on trust conceptualization for quite a while now. So these topics are extremely interesting for me. And my questions to both presenters would mainly concern conceptual foundations. Because I find, and I really have to start with an apology, and I will try to be as short as possible with this. And please do tell me if I'm too long. So I have to start with an apology. Usually, these research are using quite well-defined trust concepts. Whereas the actual field of trust conceptualization is really not as well defined. So there are a lot of competing concepts, and the one that seems to be highlighted here, the willingness to be vulnerable, willingness to give data, or this experience and information-based risk uncertainty reducing attitude. That is one possible concept, but as per my research, my knowledge, it is not one that grasps the phenomenon really well. So these are called the so-called cognitive concepts of trust, whereas there's another huge approach, the so-called non-cognitive concepts, which say that these understandings of trust are defining a different concept, reliance, which arises in a state where there's no trust there anymore. So these mainly concern states where there's distrust, mistrust, or lack of trust. So I am not really surprised that in the first presentation, which was extremely interesting, there were no evidence of increase in trust with these information giving techniques, because according to some schools of trust conceptualization, information does not create trust. It creates reliance, which can support trust, but it doesn't create trust in itself. And I would be really interested in what kind of literature on the concept of trust was used here. And to the second presenter, Balázs, I would also like to ask the same question. And also, I'm quite interested in why how he really got to these very interesting consequences or results, which are in a way very much in line with these non-cognitive concepts, but also seem to be a little bit missing the point for me, at least, because these familiarity, reducing of risks, control, insurance are basically means that we use when there is destroyed trust or a lack of trust or distrust in some way. So these safeguards.
Can we maybe go to?
This is my wrap up. Thank you very much.
So, because I also would like to see whether there are other questions, but I think it's a very relevant question. So also when I started reading about trust, I discovered how many different definitions there are. So I think it's a great question, but let's also give our two speakers the opportunity to respond. Maybe Bjorn, you can. Very much. Yeah. So thank you for raising the question.
Yeah, no, it's a really good question, actually. Actually, as Esther said, there's such an enormous amount of trust definitions. I'm not familiar with the reliance one, I must admit. So if you can send actually a reference on that or something, that would be interesting. Regardless, the question itself is what literature was used in our case. So I relied mostly, at least for the trust in government side of things and the trust in project side of things, on the public administration literature, which eventually, well, for a large part, finds its origins more in organization sciences and psychology. I think if you've studied the conceptualizations, the classic ones, this comes more from the Rousseau side of things, more on the cognitive side, I guess, also with the ABI dimensions, so ability, benevolence, and integrity. So that's mostly what's split up in. Do you think that actor is competent? Do you think that actor is benevolent towards you? And do you think that actor handles itself according to the relevant rules, basically, right? That's the integrity part. So that's a cognitive approach to it. That's true. It's also been criticized in our literature line as being more related to trustworthiness, perceived trustworthiness, than actual trust. Actually missed the vulnerability dimension. That's why we also included the behavioral component. So that is basically it for trust in government. Now I do have to admit that it becomes a bit different, of course, again for trust in AI, because trust in government normally presupposes that you have a trustee with certain motivations, which is absent in the context of technology, right? So in that area for trust in technology, more specifically, it is a bit more on reliance, the performance of the system, and let's see, functionality it is, helpfulness, and reliability. Those were the ones. So I'm not sure whether that equates with what you mean by reliance in that context, and whether you would also place it in trust for trustworthiness. What I do agree with is that these conceptualizations are often a bit difficult in a sense, as it's very difficult for a human, I think, to conceptualize a relationship in which he is directly vulnerable to the entire government. So the trustee, in a sense, is absent in trust in government research. So that's normally, I think, Harden has a few very good pieces on that as well, and I mostly agree with him in that regard. It's almost always more about perceived trustworthiness than anything else. But yeah, I don't know if this answers your question, but yeah.
From my side, I fully agree. Trust is a very personal and subjective state of the trustor. Therefore, I don't really want to focus on that. The question really is, the large question is that trust should not be misplaced. So that trustworthy should be trusted and the untrustworthy should not be trusted, which makes me focus on the trustworthiness of the trustee, and that often can be independently assessed and verified. or like supported by certain types of safeguards, and whether the trustworthiness of the trustee comes from a long history of good behavior, or it comes from being well regulated or well governed, or comes from being party of a very strict and well written contract, is a question which can then be again looked at. How trust and these external controls or the external supports for trustworthiness are actually related. I think the legal literature has a lot of thinking about this. Some say, well, you need trust to contract. Others say, well, if you are entered into a contract, then it's a very good basis on which you can actually build trust upon. Another strand of literature says that if you signal that you want to enter into a contract with a counterparty, that means that you don't trust. It's a bad signal it's a signal for distrust. I think all of these theories are right. I don't think that one of them is better than the other. I think they appropriately describe different situations which can emerge equally frequently. The question is, yes, sometimes we rely on contracts, sometimes we rely on gentlemen's agreements, sometimes we rely on the counterparty well regulated, sometimes we rely on the counterparty being a technological, being under technological constraints. And the question is how these different trust safeguards are collaborating in particular situations to actually facilitate social economic interaction. And that is the case, right? It's not the trust which is the case. The case is, or the interesting question is whether those exchanges which require trust actually are taking place or not. So, yeah, I don't think trust is the most important question. Trustworthiness and whether interactions take place are way more important.
Yeah, so thanks to both of the speakers for your responses. Are there other questions? I would like to take one more question, Sophie, if you allow us. I also have one actually burning question if there's nobody else, because I would like to also sort of link back to Shyam and his presentation, because basically both Bjorn and Balázs seem to be a little bit skeptical about the role of information and transparency, whereas if I have understood Shyam's presentation well, he seems to really emphasize the importance of information. And we could even link this to the previous panel too, where also Michelle also talked a lot about the importance of information. And this also seems to go in different directions. Also confirming what Balázs was just saying, that sometimes these literatures or studies seem to be contradictory, but they may all be right, depending on the context and the situation. So maybe Bjorn, Balázs, you want to reflect on that? Maybe Shyam or also Michelle wants to add a final thought on that, so that we sort of wrap up and bring the different presentations together before we move to Sophie.
Do you want to start, Balázs, or should I?
Yes, go ahead.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, I think actually Shyam and our results can actually be reconciled, and that's one reason I asked this as well. There's recently been a public demonstration experiment as well. A few days ago, it was published in PAL actually by Esther van Zimmeren. There's also Esther van Zimmeren in Utrecht doing similar research. And what they do, and that's, I think it's also coming back to what Ferenc said, I think it's more dependent on the treatment you include in your experiments rather than the measurement itself, because we also had support, for instance, and it didn't have an impact on that as well. And I think the major difference between our treatments is that we provide information in the form of a general press release, as you might see it there, or a general media article, that a random citizen not using the system might see. What Shyam, for instance, does, I think at least, judging from your presentation, correct me if I'm wrong, but at least Stefan and Esther have done as well, is confront respondents far more specifically with a specific algorithm that behaves in a certain way, present, for instance, outputs of that algorithm, whether that output can be explained, for instance, how the output is framed. And that's, of course, a far stronger intervention, but does presuppose that in real life, if you would encounter that, you would actually see the algorithm. You would actually see some algorithmic output with some explanation of that algorithm. And I think there, because it applies more to your specific case, the impact of the treatment is far greater than it was in my case. But of course, both audiences are relevant, especially in the public sector, I think. So I think that's how our results can be reconciled. But I do have to admit, my results have to be replicated as well. But yeah.
Balázs, maybe, and then Shyam. Michelle,
Yeah,
if you want.
Yeah, what I'm concerned about is that we focus on transparency and try to exclusively and treat it as a silver bullet and treat the transparency of a technical system as the dominant way of ensuring the trustworthiness of a complex technosocial assemblage. I think even if Google is able to produce an explainable AI, that is not enough to actually establish the trustworthiness of that system. We have to take into account the motives, the governance, the regulatory environment of the firm which produces that technical system. And even if the actual technical system is transparent, this question is still there. Is Google acting in its users' best interest, or is it acting in its shareholders' best interests? If it acts in the best interest of the Chinese government in Hong Kong, is this a reason for us to trust it here in Europe or in the US? So there are a lot of questions which are not answered by the transparency of the actual technical infrastructure, which are all relevant to the trustworthiness of that system that we are relying on. So I really appreciate the work, all the work on transparency. I'm not saying that it's not useful, and I'm not saying that it cannot actually increase the trustworthiness of these things. But what I'm saying is that even if we are able to produce meaningful transparency for an AI system, that doesn't solve any of our problems in the first place.
Maybe first, Michelle, if you want, and then Shyam, as you were our keynote speaker, of all the speakers before Sophie, you have the last word.
Yes, well, very briefly, the link between transparency, information, and trust. What we see from our research results in our survey, but also now the in-depth interviews we are conducting with users and non-users, is that there are a lot of misunderstandings on how the system works. So in the case of contact tracing apps, and especially in the case of Belgium, I really see that there is a lack of information on how the system works, and so this gives room for speculations, for scenarios that are invented concerning what the technology is able to. So I think that by visualizing, by presenting very clearly how contact tracing works, that it can make a difference and also deal with that uncertainty and the lack of trust that a lot of people still have for contact tracing apps.
Shyam, please go ahead. Now it's up to you.
Thank you.
Amaze
us.
us.
Yeah, this is a fascinating discussion. Yeah, I think I'm seeing a lot of confluences in all our thought processes here. So maybe I should just start with this whole notion of the role of information in trust. And what I think we sometimes under-recognize, and this is the psychologist in me and not the technologist, is that human beings are not very consistent. So some of the trust measures that we have and the trust scales that we use in a lot of our research are split in 3 different ways. There's cognitive trust, which has to do with your thoughtful ability to trust and thoughtful willingness to trust. And then there's affective trust, which is your just feeling trustworthiness. And then there's behavioral trust, which, we might, oftentimes criticize the platform, criticize the, big tech, but we end up using it day to day. We are all, in some ways enslaved by these technologies that offer so many conveniences. So while cognitively we may not trust, behaviorally we seem to show that we trust, right? So we need to recognize that human beings are not necessarily consistent in terms of their attitudes, their behaviors, and their cognitions. And so when we try to capture trust, it all boils down to what is it that we are measuring in that particular study. And therefore, you will find different studies showing different findings because they're, tapping into different constructs of the larger idea of trust. And I also liked Balázs's point about mistrust, that we should start with mistrust. And, there's a literature in our, area, which I briefly kind of alluded to about algorithm aversion. So there are a lot of people who start with an aversion. On the other side are people who have automation bias, which is they think everything automated is great, so they overtrust. But people who have aversion are the people who undertrust, or maybe in Balázs's word, mistrust. And that's a very skeptical stance to take. And so there are also stable individual differences. Again, we have to take into account human psychology. That is, it's not only that we adapt different types of trust, but we also need to recognize that different people are different in terms of their approach to trust. They're not all looking at the scale in the same way. This goes to Ferris's point about methodology. Also, I think Balázs's most recent comment speaks to this importance of locus of trust. Who or what are we trusting? Is it the technology, is it the techne, the system, or is it the platform, or is it the product, or is it the government agency that is sponsoring that particular algorithm? So just because something is transparent or explainable does not mean that we will trust the source. Just because a politician explains why they are racist or why they're against immigrants, right? They might give you a very fine explanation for why immigrants are bad, but that doesn't mean that we will trust that politician's stance on immigration, right? So source is important, and their explanations are just a way to justify whatever the source agenda is. And that agenda may or may not be something that you agree with. And therefore you will have a disconnect and you will not trust as a result. So one final point I want to make, and this again refers to the methodological question that started this discussion, is in our field, in the field of communication, we often look at trust as just one element of a larger construct of credibility. So credibility is the bigger concept under which we kind of subsume trust, and expertise is another factor. There are attractiveness factors. Some sources are more attractive than others. There's also similarity issues, how much kinship you feel with that source. So all of that together with trustworthiness, builds this notion of credibility. So if a government, in the first place, like if the Hungarian government lacks credibility, no amount of explainability and transparency in their systems is going to restore your trust in the government of Hungary, right? So that's why it's important for us to think of the larger construct of credibility when we are talking about trust. Thank you.
So thank you indeed. You lived up to my expectations of bringing everything nicely together. So thanks to all of the speakers of this panel.